Greetings and welcome back to 303 in Junior English. We now turn to page 882-883 in Robert Frost's Acquainted with the Night. Your background information at the top of 883 tells us that Frost wrote this poem in Stanza rima, a verse form invented by the Italian poet Dante. We'll see more about this in a second. The form is very challenging in English, and Frost's poem is one of only a few examples in American literature. For that reason and many others, this is another really famous offering by Robert Frost. I'm not going to say anything, though, about this in terms of setup. All I'm going to do is I'm just going to read it with you. When we finish, though, I'm going to ask you if there is a poem that we have read by Frost already, this is a 3A observation, right, that somehow goes along with this poem, Acquainted with the Night. To be acquainted means that you are comfortable with or you know, right? If you are acquainted with somebody, then you know them. Acquainted with the night. I have been one acquainted with the night. I've walked out in rain and back in rain. I've outwalked the furthest city light. I've looked down the saddest city lane. I've passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I've stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. Now, I asked for you to think about what poem of Frost's already that we've studied goes along with this. And obviously, if you wrote down stopping by woods on a snowy evening, you're dead on right. If you will, this is kind of like the correlate city poem to that country, woodsy, forest poem. Okay? Goes together well. But I'm actually going to begin really quickly at 2B. This will not shock you. Notice how many times we start here. Let's play some interesting games, though, for a second to just point out Robert Frost's genius. First of all, let's just go ahead and count up number of lines. Uh-oh. How many lines do we have in this poem? You, by the way, can do this really quickly. You don't have to actually count for each line, do you? All you have to do is just look and find line 10 and then add up beyond line 10. How many lines do we have? How many are there? Right, 14. What does that tell you right away? What does it tell you if it's a 14-line offering? We got a word for it. You're right. This is a sonnet. Excellent. So let's go ahead and just point it out right away. A 14-line offering is a sonnet. So we're clearly playing a very closed game, poetically speaking, for Frost. Can I write a poem of 14 lines, a sonnet? Notice the end rhyme. Let's just pay attention to it. Night, light. Okay. Notice the second stanza. Lane, explain. Feet, street. By, sky. Right, night. Rhymed couplet at the end of the poem. Okay? But let's point out something else interesting, and to do that, let's read down below. By the way, just to point out what your textbook's pointing out, right, this blank verse. I have looked down the saddest city lane. That's one way to read it. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have looked down the saddest city lane. Watch my hands. I have looked down the saddest city lane. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. That ba-bum is unstressed, stressed, iambic foot. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. 5 of those is pentameter. So we have a sonnet of iambic pentameter. So we're clearly playing in the Renaissance tradition. Speaking of the Renaissance tradition, read with me at the bottom of 883. Stanza rima. Stanza rima is Italian for third rhyme. For those of you, for example, who love things like rap music, here we go. The origin of rap music, many people don't understand this, goes way back to the early poetic attempts during the Renaissance to play within closed form and understanding the power of meter. People are attracted to a certain kind of meter. Let's take a look. Stanza rima, Italian for third rhyme, is a form of poetry consisting of 3-line stanzas with the rhyme scheme A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, D, C, and so on. In other words, Go back and look at it really quickly. Notice that the last word of the second line, again, you people that are interested in rap, you're going to love this. Take a look. The last word of the second line is the word what? Rain. Which rhymes with the last word of the second stanza, lane, explain. The last word of the fifth line is beat, which rhymes with what? Feet and street. Do you see it? The last word of the third stanza middle line, right, line 8, is cry, and then we're going to rhyme by and sky. Notice last word of line 11 is height, and we're going to go right, night. In other words, back to your box at the bottom of the page. The first and the third lines of each stanza rhyme with each other, and the second line rhymes with the first and the third lines of the following stanza. Are you ready for this? Dante, the great poet, roughly 1300, was the first to write a long epic poem, his masterpiece, the Divine Comedy. We've mentioned it several times in class together. In Tres Rima, the entire poem is written like this. Thousands of lines of poetry Dante wrote. The entire Divine Commedia is written this way. Whoa! Very hard to do, right? Very hard to do. This choice was not accidental for Dante. In the Christian tradition, the number 3 is symbolic of the divine, and this number informs all levels of the poem structure. Of course, what's our other word for 3? Trinity. For those of you that went to Sunday school, you probably are familiar with that term. The work, Dante's Divine Comedy, is divided into, guess what? How many sections? 3. The Inferno, or Hell, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Each of which, in turn, is divided into, are you ready for this? 33 subsections called cantos. Altogether, the sections tell the story of the poet's imaginary journey through hell, purgatory, and finally into the light of heaven. In addition to its association with the number 3, Tres Rima is a fitting verse structure for Dante's poem. The rhymes, echoing between stanzas and linking one to the next, draw the reader forward, just as the poet himself was compelled forward on his epic journey. By the way, let's just jot down at level 3A really quickly. Dante, of course, comes to mind immediately because those are the lines that T.S. Eliot quotes, you'll remember, right at the beginning of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Okay. We've mentioned Dante so many times because his Divine Comedy and that trip, especially through Hell, Inferno, plays such an influential role in the idea of poetry in the West after Dante publishes Divine Comedy. Of course, the connect to the literature at the very bottom of the page says, with its cycling rhythm scheme and reflections of a Christian worldview, Tres Rima was a meaningful verse form for Dante's epic. Explain how it fits the action and setting of Frost's 20th century poem. Well, that's a good question. In other words, why? Why would Frost? I mean, clearly, this took him a long time to be able to pull this off, right? Why would Frost play this game in this poem? Does the structure, let's write it this way at level 2B, does the structure of the poem have any correlation to the meaning of the poem? Okay? Let's ask if they go together. Well, to do that, we got to ask now at level 1, what is this poem actually about? Now that we've played this game, right? When I read the poem, for example, I'm not going to read it as, I have looked down the sad Acid Elaine. I'm not going to do it that way, although I could, and then immediately I could hear really easily the iambic pentameter. I'm not going to do that. But when I read it again, now we're going to ask this simple question. What actually is going on in this poem? We have a first-person speaker, I, who's going to tell us that he likes to do something. Let's take a look. I have been one acquainted with the night. I've walked out in rain and back in rain. So I'll pause. Write it down at level 1. See, I'm helping you do an annotation of this that can prep for the exam. What's he saying he likes to do? When you say you're acquainted with the night, what does that mean? That means obviously you spend a lot of time with the night. Uh-oh, do I have any insomniacs in the class? People who do not sleep at night, they like to go out for long drives and for long walks or whatever. Do I have any of us that like to walk? A few of us do. Yeah, you bet. Like to go for walks, for example, and especially at night. Notice he says, I've walked out in rain and back in rain, which means what? Walking for him is not contingent on weather. It's not like he gets up in the middle of the night and goes, oh, it's raining outside, I'm not going to go for a walk. No. He's going to go for a walk anyway. Look at the next line. I have outwalked the furthest city light. Meaning what? First of all, by the way, this does place this poem within the city. So in other words, this is an urbane poem as opposed to Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, a poem about the country. Right, he goes for walks so long that he can be outside all of the city lights, which means he walks for hours. Notice the repetition of the first word I. I. We skip for one, right? Skip for one line at line 6, and then I again, and then the very last line. I have been one acquainted with the night, which is the the opening line again. Very personal. It's a very personal poem. I've had students that say it's kind of weird, but of all the poems that you've taught me at Frost, I somehow relate more personally to this one because of the nature of the very personal voice here. Look at the next stanza. I have looked down the saddest city lane. What does that tell you? On his walks through the city. The saddest city lane means what? Well, if you go out in the city and you walk, you're going to walk into different kinds of neighborhoods. And some neighborhoods you're going to look at and go, man, I would not want to have to live in this neighborhood. Saddest city street. So he said, I've seen the worst of the city. I've passed by, now this one's a strange line, line 5, for a lot of students today because they don't know the reference. Let's read it. I passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. What does this mean, watchman on his beat? Well, during the time that Frost is writing, you have policemen who walk the streets. Today, of course, they predominantly will drive their vehicles, right? Their cruisers. But in this time, you actually had a night watchman, policeman, who just walked on the street, and that meant he walked right by you. But notice, he says when he walked by the watchman on his street, he drops his eyes. Now that doesn't mean that his eyeballs fall out of his right? We're speaking idiomatically here. What does this mean, I dropped my eyes? We don't mean that his eyeballs fell on the floor and he has to pick them up and no. What does it mean, I dropped my eyes? I looked down. Unwilling to explain. Explain what? What is it that he doesn't want to do? Right, we have an individual who likes to go walking at night, even in the rain, but he doesn't like talking about it, which is ironic. Why? What are we doing? Reading a poem. A poem by a speaker who says, I don't really want to talk about it, but I am acquainted with the night. I know the night. Now we'll get obviously into this question at level 2. Is the night symbolic of anything? We'll get there in a bit. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. Now that's a thought. So read those lines again and put it in your own words at level 1. Read it with me again. He says, I have stood still. In other words, now all of a sudden he's not walking. Stop the sound of feet. In other words, he's not walking. When far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street. In other words, he heard what? So he's walking and all of a sudden he hears what? Yeah, a voice, right? Stops. But not to call me back or say goodbye. This is a solitary walker. He has no one to call him back or say goodbye. Our speaker of our poem knows what it's like to be completely alone. And when he hears somebody calling, it makes him stop. But he immediately knows whoever is calling, they're not calling to me, they're calling to somebody else. Because I have nobody to call to me. And further still, in an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed, the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with it. What's this all about, this clock thing? What's going on there? Clock. Says, I've been walking and then I stop for 2 reasons. One, the first reason I stop is some voice. I hear it. And I stop for a moment even though I know it's not for me. Because I don't have anybody to call my name. The second reason I stop is ding, 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 ding. Right? A clock set maybe up in a tower dings the time of the night. And he says, when I hear the dinging, I stop. But what's interesting, he says about this luminary clock, this luminary meaning showing light, right? Giving off light, was that it says something about the time, but it says that the time is neither wrong nor right. In other words, it doesn't mean anything to him if it dings 3 times as opposed to 5 times. He's got no connection to time. He somehow feels outside of time and space as he walks, as he's acquainted with the night. By the way, just to point out, I often, with you as juniors, will make references to titles you have not yet read. Next year as a senior, you will read with me Lord Byron's She Walks in Beauty Like the Night, of borrowed climes and starry skies. The notion of walking in the night and like the night. Of course, Frost probably very acquainted with the Byron poem. So let's now do a quick 2A observation here. Messages, themes. Well, there's been several that students will point out about this title. 1, this is a poem about what it's like to be alone. What it's like to be isolated. What it's like to feel alienated and alone. Which does beg an interesting question, a second observation. Do you make a distinction between being alone and being lonely? Jot that question down and see what you think. The difference between being alone, nobody's around, and lonely. I've had juniors, for example, that say, I can be with 100 other people and be lonely. I can be completely alone and not be lonely. Well, then what's the difference? Well, we might say loneliness is a state of mind. Being alone is a state of the geography of your body as in proximity to other people. But loneliness is something quite different. Which begs another interesting question in 2A. Do you think some people are born to be loners? There are some students at Worland High School who are kind of known. If you ask people about them, they will often say, you know, they don't really hang out with too many people. They're just kind of loners. Do you think people are born that way, or do they choose to be that? For example, notice in this poem, do you have any sense that this guy in this poem feels sorry for himself or herself? Geez, I wish I wasn't all by myself. I wish I had somebody to walk with me. Well, one line seems to suggest that maybe the speaker would like to have somebody who calls to him or calls him back or says goodbye. He doesn't have that. But directly, there doesn't seem to be a lot of woe is me. Maybe it's more like it is what it is. Finally, this poem seems to play the very similar games that we are playing with stopping by woods on a snowy evening. It's almost like it's the city partner, we might say, right? Notice in this poem that it's as if the speaker views his life as having had times of isolation, loneliness, maybe we might even say despair. But somehow he seems to accept all of this. It is what it is, kind of almost resigned to it. At 2B, I mean, we can't say enough about the G. If you're not impressed with this, this is what I would challenge you to do. You sit down and write 14 lines of iambic pentameter with a rhyme scheme that strays around it. You do it for 14 lines. Dante, of course, did it for, well, you know, thousands of lines. But you do it just to see how hard it is to be able to say anything, right? But obviously to say something as interesting and profound as what Frost is pulling off is remarkable. Level 3. At 3A, let's relate this title to other titles that maybe we're familiar with. What is for you your favorite walking along and alone song? Do you have a tune of all tunes when you are alone? Do you have a luminary clock of music? Do you have a playlist that you listen to when you are all by yourself? What for you is your favorite movie about the night and being alone in the night? It's funny, I ask this question sometimes and students go, you know, I guess I haven't really thought about that, but some of my favorite movies almost all seem to happen at night, in the dark. What is that all about? Notice, for example, superhero movies. Question, when do the majority of the action sequences happen? during the night or the day? You go back and look at all of these superhero movies, from Spider-Man to Batman to the most recently released Wonder Woman, and ask the simple question, when do most of the fighting and action sequences happen? During the day or during the night? And some of you will go, wow, it's almost like 3-to-1 night. Right. Why is that? Because all kinds of interesting things happen at night. Of course, we can think about Shakespeare and his understanding of the power of the night. The beginning of Macbeth, where are we? On a heath, the middle of the night. Hamlet, the very witching hour of night, middle of the night. Lots of cool things happening in the middle of the night. Finally, of course, we can ask some interesting questions that are personal. How do you relate to a poem like this? Do you relate to a person who says, I totally get it, being all by myself, being all alone, but not really feeling lonely. People maybe think that I'm lonely, but I just like being by myself. There's kind of, it seems to me, two types of people. Which are you on a Friday night if you have nobody there with you? Two kinds of people. One kind of junior says, yes, I'm all alone. Turn off my phone, shut my door, nobody messes with me for the whole night, I can do whatever I want. Another kind of junior goes, oh man, I'm all by myself. I gotta do something. I gotta like call somebody. I gotta like do something. I'm not gonna sit here in my room all night. I'm a loser if I sit here all night. What is going on? Which begs a really interesting question. Two of them. Are you kind of born hardwired, like the color of your eyes? Are you kind of born hardwired to either be a loner or to need people? Second question. Do you find that you kind of move in and out of these needs? So if you look back over your life of 16, 17 years, you say, there were moments in my life when I didn't want to be around lots of other people, for whatever reason. And there are other moments in my life when I desperately needed to be around other people.